Welcome to our second session of urban policy analysis. As you can see, we are successfully decentralizing, so you can be here in person, or it's fine to be anywhere else that's comfortable. And syllabus briefly lists this. We're getting it all clear, so we'll have multiple options. The first session is recording on Zoom. It's not on Zoom, it's on YouTube. It's not very clear sound, so we're trying to get that better, and it should be that way henceforth, we hope. Books. One of you went to the seminary co-op, which is where they, in earlier years, they would have lots of books there sitting. Because of COVID, they sometimes have adapted that to saying, we will send them to the students' home. So you don't need to go there, and they should be there very rapidly. That is, they don't go to co-op at all. The co-op will have them sent to your home, or you can use Amazon, and most of the books are available as ebooks. If you want an ebook, you can just have the ebook instantly. So ebooks, Amazon, seminary are all options you can use as you prefer. These are all pretty widely used books, and there are secondhand copies available both online and in the past at the bookstore. But let us know if you have trouble finding any of the books at this point as we proceed. Any other logistical questions like that you want to raise? Your hand's not up? No, okay.
Professor, while you're at
yeah.
that, I'm just going to step behind or actually get the remote so that I can change the view.
Okay, great. We're dealing in this first section with leadership, big issue, and it's the first simple answer that people use in defining what leads to policy. And if you say, well, we have WASP or Black or Irish leaders, that should explain in some way the policies and everything about the local government. That's a crude over deterministic statement, as I will show you more today, and you can see in the readings in many respects. I mentioned this last time in saying everything, leadership, capitalism, etc., explains about 15%. That is, nothing is deterministic if you look more closely. And we're getting more powerful methods of showing that precisely, which I'll introduce some results from in this session. Let me just say as very quick background in terms of the studies of local areas. These have lagged way behind the studies of nations. So I've sometimes said that cities and neighborhoods are fruit flies. National governments and nations are dinosaurs. Should we study dinosaurs or fruit flies, or let's say different kinds of in-between animals, subjects, ourselves, if we want to understand how policy is made and leadership and politics work? And I would say the ideal answer is all of those. So if we can have a way of capturing why is China different using some national Chinese data, comparing, say, to India and the UK and other places. And then we have a way of looking at those characteristics which we've identified as perhaps distinctively Chinese. Can we find variations within China that show more or less of this? So and this is what our group, especially, that we have a scenes academy that is working in China, and they're working on doing just this. So and so you can do that statistically and show we control for 25 or 3 or 17 variables, depending on the data you have. You can do this with cases. And so within China, our book Scenescapes was well, let's say there was a national news media group called Red Star. And they put on a broadcast of people talking about domestic and local policies in China 2 weeks before the 5-year plan is being put together this February. 2 weeks later, the economic goal of say 12% growth or 8% growth, which has been so focused on from Mao, since Mao was there up to last year, they dropped it. They don't mention an economic growth goal. They do mention scenes 5 times. Okay, so the video, we made a 10-minute video that showed to 60 million people, and discussions of it circulated around in the news media among popular groups, local groups. The city of Chengdu has had this last year more tourists and visitors in the holiday, or the New Year holiday, spring break, in I think it's in February, more than did Shanghai or Beijing. And the growth rate is faster. The 1 year was increased by the COVID specifics of those cities. So if you go back and look historically, Chengdu was going up like this, Beijing and Shanghai more like that. So these are big policies. These cities are all about 4 times as big as New York, London, and Paris. Europeans, Americans are small stuff in numbers compared to the Chinese. Okay, so the city of Chengdu, basically the top official, the mayor, was appointed, but basically very creative guy. He read some of the stuff on scenes, and he and his staff have been building scenes kinds of themes. So they have a river, and we'll see some things like this from other cities, including Milwaukee, that I'll talk about today. But I'm mentioning the Chengdu as an example of the national, local, international, regional impacts affecting each other. So it's not just any one thing. How can we see this more generally? Historically, I mean, this is very current, present stuff. If we go back, where and why do we have these misleading, or let's say overstated theories? Just taking China for a minute, China and Russia, and the West, look at the role of Marxism. Marxism was central, obviously, in Russia and China. The revolution with Mao or with Lenin, these were huge Marxist, communist-inspired revolutions. What's the role of Marxism today inside China? Still, it's ambivalent. It's not officially abandoned, but within Russia, Putin's party is not the Communist Party. Putin's not a communist. Okay, so you have a secularization, and this has been called secular Marxism by some, to say that we can use Marxism, and I will cite Marxist ideas many times here. People in the West use Marxist concepts, but the question is, are we treating him as a social scientist, as an analyst, or are we treating him as God? He used to be God in the Little Red Book and in the days of Mao. He no longer is for most people in China. And so North Korea in that sense is very different. But we've got and Cuba's going through this right now, but these kinds of linkages between an official ideology, a strong party, and then differences as these begin to transform themselves are critical for us to be able to see where and why these policies shift. Okay. In some places, these are national decisions heavily, especially political party decisions in Europe, and I'd say Russia and China as well. But In the US, these are much more local decisions. So you can have local political parties because they're much weaker. National parties are much weaker in the US. The amount of money going to the local officials, the contacts, the communications, the slating of candidates, big issue. Who gets slated to be run as mayor? The national parties are key in France and England and well, in China and South Korea, they're still basically more, or they were recently appointed in small towns in China that have local elections and villages and so forth, but not for the big cities or the national government. So we're in how, but I'm pointing another corollary I would say, just I'll leave it as a sentence for now. Democracy is not defined as national elections. Democracy is much more complicated. It's a variable, just like economic growth or satisfaction. It's not a black and white yes, no. There are many aspects of participation, legitimacy, engagement, and the Chinese have been getting, I would say, just to throw this out, more and more participatory, more open, more, and so Xi as president is reacting against the fact that China has become, in just before and during some of his own leadership, so much more open, and students, programmers, protesters in Hong Kong, for instance, could take on the national government and the national government in Beijing and not be beaten up, carried away. They were with Tiananmen Square. So the Tiananmen Square, Hong Kong is a major illustration of my general point. She is dealing with a much more open Chinese society domestically, which is not reported in the Western press, or very minimally. So I've learned enormous amounts by having about 100 Chinese postdocs or some grad students here and being in sessions with them week after week after week after week and talking about these and getting Chinese and other data. So we're going to use China, the US, India, if we can get some. We're looking for data to see how much to use India, because these are, in India and China are the future in many respects. They're huge countries, much better than the West, and where and how they are going through changes right now, and looking at for variations within them is a critical part of understanding. And we'll start more with US and Western examples, but we'll go back and forth and try to bring in more these bigger changes, which we know are there, even though we don't have always comparable data. Okay, the quick background history, Marxism. One of the most famous studies in urban politics and community studies was done by Robert and Helen Lind in the late 20s or late 20s. Middletown was Muncie, Indiana, little Midwestern town. They called it Middletown, and they wrote it up and they said, well, this is it. This is America. This is the world, maybe. The first book called Middletown was a holistic community study. There was almost no mention of who owned the factories or politics. It was about religion. It was about what people did on Sundays, what kinds of 4th of July parades they had, other things like that. The Depression came along, the crash. 1933, the election of Roosevelt, the battles, especially in intellectual circles. Marxism was seen as the answer. The second volume, Middletown in Transition, heavily influenced by Marxism. And so they basically focused much more on the who owned the factory. There's one main factory in town where they made bell jars that your grandmother or your mother used to use for making preserves of peaches or other things like that. Okay, so it's the most nationally famous jar company. It's the top industry there, and the family was very paternalistic and dominating in Middletown and Transition. We still mentioned this stuff in the earlier book. So then that became debated, but that I would say not only did that define, that reflected the tone of many intellectuals and social scientists from after 1929, 1933. Many people like Daley worked in the Roosevelt administration, etc. This continued up through the next book that really made an input, which illustrated this most powerfully, was Floyd Hunter, Hunter, Community Power Structure. He was a PhD student here at SSA. He went to work as a social worker in Atlanta. He wanted to write it up as a PhD thesis. He started, and he said, I was at a couple of conferences with him where he said this openly. I started to write a scholarly book, and I said, nobody's going to read it. So I threw it in the garbage can. Started over. And I said, I'm going to write a bestseller. And he succeeded. There's almost no mention of Marx or Marxism. There's almost no mention of any serious analysis or data and so forth. But he generated what he called a series of what he didn't call it, but I mean the most widely used label is reputational analysis. And what he did was ask people who are the most important people in Atlanta. That was almost his exact question. He started with a list, he got from journalists, and maybe 10 people, and then he went to them, and they in turn said, I would also add so and so and so and so. So he asked the elite, who is the elite? And who's important? He didn't define important. Okay. He got an interconnected set of business, a few civic leaders who are mostly lawyers, and a couple of other professionals. And he said, this is illustrating business dominance, capitalism. He didn't use the word capitalism very much. He sort of said, this is life. Okay. This continued on this was 1953. He published it until 1961. Robert Dahl then published Who Governs, which is on our reading list. And Who Governs said, Floyd Hunter is dead wrong. Why? And what we wanted, I want to introduce now some of the more specific concepts which we're still using today in studies of power all around the world. That is, this is where the best studies of power and decision making were put together along with leadership. We'll only go through some of this, but we'll go through more of it in a section later on in the course called Community Power. But let me just put on one or two things. Issue specific. Don't ask who has the power. Ask who's important in helping elect the mayor. Who's important in school board decisions? Who's important in economic development? And that's what Dahl asked. And you get three different answers he showed in New Haven. Three different sets of people. So you have this, and the only person really seriously in the middle of all three was the mayor. Business did not dominate in the mayoral election or in the school board at all. And the PTA and the teachers union didn't care about economic development as done by the banks and business leaders, where the banks and business leaders were important for economic development. So there are different kinds of issue areas. That is a major point. This breaks up the earlier simplification of left and right. Instead of saying he's on the left, she's on the right, you say, what are the issues that are important to you? Okay. The quick corollary of this was Philip Converse, sociologist at Michigan, who showed if you take surveys and ask people at the beginning of the questionnaire, beginning of the survey, do you support unions or not? And you ask it in a little different way. Are you in favor of unions having more power or not? The people who answered the two consistently are about 10% of the US population. 90%, roughly 92% of Americans do not have structure ideology in this very loose, weakly defined sense. So there's a whole literature on that, but basically people said, but some people really care about drag racing, or motorcycles, or red shoes, or swimming pools? How do we deal with that? The answer is issue specificity. People, lots of people, lots more people than 10% have strong interest in a particular area, but it's often in private personal consumption rather than in more general abstract things like, do you support the left or the right or the Democratic or Republican Party? Okay, these ideas destroy the determinism of economic domination. They destroy the determinism of left and right. And as you go further, these get more refined or different ways of measuring this. But Twitter, so another big idea, campaign contributions. People who have the most money win the elections, and the people who give them the money control. How many times have you heard that? Okay. How about Donald Trump? He had a whole lot of money. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, others before him had hundreds of millions of dollars. Trump used Twitter. He tweeted. People don't talk about this very much. But he spent almost nothing in his first elections. Even though he had it, he could have, but he won. So there are data that Stanford political science people are analyzing the data. We know who gives the money to each mayor in the country, who gave how much money. So within the business community, we can differentiate people on Wall Street, finance, from manufacturing, from other kinds of industries, and see how many contributed to Trump versus Hillary Clinton, et cetera. So the quick story there is business is highly divided. A majority, I'll ask you, where did the majority of Wall Street finance, let's say the operational measures, the finance industry, did most of their money go to Trump or Clinton? Clinton is the answer. Okay. So Trump in debates blamed her for that. He said, she's going to Wall Street. She sold out to Wall Street. So he would, okay. So I don't want to engage. I don't want to sound as if I'm supporting one or another ideology. I'm simply saying these are issues you can debate over in Twitter, and that has changed. That has changed a lot of these other things. Okay, so Donald introduced issue specificity. I'll just put out here a couple of other concepts. I'm not going to elaborate. We'll talk about them later in the course. But the big points then are resources. How can be defined as resources in contrast to decisions that people actually make? That is, who do you vote for? Who do you give money to? Those are decisions. Those are not just the resources. The resources are things like money, votes, which can come into you, but whether or how you use them there's a moderate linkage here. If Bill Gates has more money than anybody, or Amazon, other folks, they got lots of money. How much are they spending in the little towns where they live, or the big cities where they live? Or are they spending in different places in elsewhere? That's a very different question. And most people ignore, that is, the normal assumptions that people with lots of money have a lot of impact. Darwin studied this and found that when the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the late 19th century got voted out, did they fight? Did they use their money and their resources to try to undermine the Irish and other leadership? The answer was no. They moved to the suburbs and they left politics. Okay. What percentage of Americans vote for local officials, mayors and city councilmen? What? 20, 30%. 70% could be mobilized if there's an issue which gets them angry, like the first black mayor. In Chicago, when Harold Washington ran, African Americans, about 20, a little over 20% of African Americans voted for local elections. Harold Washington Harold Washington wasn't chosen. The organizers were Jesse Jackson, Dorothy Tillman, and others. I started an oral history of Chicago with Bill Grimshaw, who was the campaign manager with his wife Jackie of Harold Washington. And for 6 months before, they did things like go in Brownsville, they stop all the cars at the stoplights, and they'd say, you know, you can't go there. You have to have 20, 30 people go out there with little clipboards. Will you sign this petition for Harold Washington? Will you contribute some money? So people signed, because Harold Washington said he would not run for mayor unless you get X signatures and a certain amount of money and a willingness to support him. So, and they would say at the stop, come alive, October 5, the day of the election. 80+% of the African Americans turned out on October 5. 20, roughly a high 80%. Pyramiding. You can pyramid your resources by combining them. Art, DJ shows, talk shows of African American radio, etc. Had a huge impact. The same thing basically happened in Gary and Detroit earlier on. That is, these were the first black mayors in the U.S. and they were very visible. They got a lot of national media, but especially turnout in local media coverage. Okay, but they illustrate the looseness between the resource of potentially voting and actually voting, and or actually talking about the election in churches or on Twitter later on, etc. Okay, and Dahl's overall name for this was pluralism. That we don't have any one factor determining everything, but we've got different issue areas, we've got different kinds of resources that can get pyramided into different combinations of coalitions. And this is a very different model than Hunter's simplified pyramid, which also goes back to the Italian Gaetano Mosca, Pareto. They basically had a pyramid kind of image. And we came along others after these two, Hunter and then Dahl, I'll just call us comparative folks. Mike Aiken, Claire Gilbert, a couple of others at the beginning. And there were 166 studies, and so we tried to say, why are they so different? Why do we have business leadership for some and others are closer to Dahl? Political leadership. The idea was to formulate some propositions about why and how we may find these kinds of differences. And this was done in the book Community Structure and Decision Making, and continues in the readings here in the later work, especially the city money. Okay. What that did was to change the question from who governs, where and when. That is what, not just leadership leads to policy output. Okay, Dahl and Hunter both had really not studied it. Dahl studied the election, but he didn't really study the budgets. He didn't study the policies in such detail as we did later on. So what we've added later on is the context. And we can have who are the citizens and how do the citizens get active in electing unions and potentially changing in this way. So that is how much is the leadership of the mayor and top civic groups party really important? And these will look at evidence through the course to see different aspects of it. This is in a certain amount in the text on the reading list by Judd and Parkinson. They focus mostly on sort of describing the big political leadership and the economic. And I'll just put in one or two findings just to give you a sense of how much changed in roughly in this period, 1980s. That is, the left and right had been much more dominant in what was called in the US the New Deal coalition from 33 to the 80s. In Europe, it was called socialist or left right or socialist versus socialist communist versus the conservative or Christian Democrats as it's being. So, and obviously, this is happening right now in a way that illustrates my general points with the Germans, with the German election, and in a very hard time to find a coalition that would. And this fragmentation among subgroups, as illustrated in the German election, as illustrated in tweets, is going on around the world. And that this is what we'll elaborate more in the section on the new political culture. But the quick answers to things like education. Education is the biggest single factor. There's an explosion of higher education in the world. And that is leading people to introduce more thinking instead of saying I'm a cog in a machine and I'm happy with it because I get a job in China, or I get my lunchbox filled in Chicago, and that okay. The two instead saying I am a thinking person, I want to vote for the party and the people and the candidates that I feel. So millions more people are saying that, and Twitter, tweets, iPhones, Samsung, other kinds of phones, whatever, are helping to mobilize citizens in ways that we've never seen before. So it's come alive October 5 is the kind of thing that started then in the Green Revolution, the Middle East, with Kiev, with Hong Kong. We've had bottom-up revolutions in that sense around the world. And these started with these same kinds of things that I'm talking about, which come along October 5. And I'm mentioning that because it was so early. And because Chicago was the strongest political party, strongest local political party in the United States by far. So if this could happen and the party could be defeated by come along October 5, then so could places with weaker parties still. That's it. Okay. So quasi-conservative groups tend to dominate the national government. Tend to dominate local governments in France. I won't try to go into too much detail, but basically, there was a change in the early 70s, and this roughly 1971, 71, 72. Mitterrand, so internationally big names. French socialists, head of the French Socialist Party, got a pretty, think of the Germans right now. He didn't have a majority. But he had a plurality. So what did he do? He formed a coalition with the communists. And the communists and socialists led France with Mitterrand as prime minister for 2-3 years. 2 years later, let me put in a number just to show how much. From 71 to 83, public sector employees expanded from about 20% of all firms in France to 48% in 1983. Nationalization of industry. The banks were taken over, big corporations, etc. The sounds like the Marxist program. It was. 2 years, I think it was 2 years, maybe 3 years later, there were local elections. And in the local elections, a whole bunch of new mayors were elected, including socialists and also others who moved in and who said, this is issue specific. We are against the nationalization of industry, but we are left on social issues, women, tolerance of immigrants, other kinds of things, drugs, etc. Lyon, Grenoble, famous local mayors. The national parties fought with these local mayors, and basically the parties crushed those mayors. In the US, instead, the local mayors began to develop what we call a new political culture. In Pittsburgh, with Peter Flaherty was a major example in the earliest period. But over the next 10 to 15 years, these new styles, such as those two mayors, spread internationally, including China. So China basically decentralized socialism from its economy and developed a quasi-capitalist economic set of arrangements within China. At the same time, that the party remained tough on general lifestyle and other kinds of issues. The Russians did the opposite. They basically said, we're throwing this all out. We're not going to have control of either the social issues or the economic issues. And the Chinese basically said they got anarchies taken over by the mafia and people who were going every which way. The economic development was lousy. Then so parts of Eastern Europe were closer to Russia to follow these various. But basically, the Chinese and the Russians were a big important contrast in this respect. Okay. So my point is, these were not just these two countries. This was happening in different ways in the socialist parties in the entire world. And Marty Lipson, who I worked with on this stuff, did a paper on how he went through country by country by country, the major socialist parties and how they changed in these years. Some call this neoliberalism. Some called it new democracy. Some called it the new political culture. Some called it the third way. These are overlapping labels for the same kinds of transformation, but they're joining the market with political leadership, nationally, local, internationally, in new ways. And people are still fighting over this in all around the world, from Berlin to Washington right now. Okay, I've got more detail. I'm going to pass over some of that. And basically, these city level differences and national coalitions and mayors tended to fall apart. Subsidy programs were widely declared failures. National governments around much of the world gave up trying to lead economic activities in the 1980s. Markets became more legitimate, and the idea spread that each city, especially the city government, should adapt to its local situation, including its economy. Judd and Parkinson had one important point which they nicely illustrate with specifics. Cities have devised different sets of strategies for coping, and so they go. It's mostly a book of case studies from Liverpool, Lyon, New York, etc. Some are highly successful, like Pittsburgh or Rennes. Others are not. A few are disastrous failures, like Detroit and Liverpool. So when Coleman Young, as I said, was speaking in this room right after his election, Detroit was an economic disaster. It has changed now in the last 5 years, and visibly they're using artists and the arts with a fair amount of success. So it's a very interesting case study. We had one guy did a BA, I think it was 220 pages. BA, this is a little bit over the limit, but it's fascinating stuff to read. So the Liverpool, I just mentioned, is briefly as it's stressed on Michael Parkinson as an extreme case. It had tough Irish unions, and the Labour Party in Liverpool said, you know, we're taking on this new prime minister named Margaret Thatcher, And so many local governments just hated her. They went the furthest. They said, we're going to drive the city into bankruptcy. We're going to spend so much that the only solution will be for the national government to bail us out the way they did in New York. Okay. What did the National Labor Party do? They kicked out the local Liverpool party members from the Labor Party and said, these people, this is not National Labor Party policy. We disown these irresponsible local people in Liverpool. So the details are there, but the point is and then of course the next step was Tony Blair. So Tony Blair basically said, I will continue the policies of Margaret Thatcher in the fiscal area on economic policy for at least 5 years. And then but nevertheless, I will bring in the Labor Party's social agenda. That we call the new political culture. Okay. This happened, as I'm pointing out, to socialist and leftist parties in much of the world, and that in turn has changed. And we used to call them social issues. What do we call them today?
Liberal issues? Liberal issues?
Yes. Well, yes, in part, but what's the one word that's also used in universities, in companies, in the media? Europeans were ahead of us in using this word, but it now is exploded in the US. It's called diversity. It's the diversity of immigrants, of women, of blacks, gays, lesbians, etc. In that sense, has become what was what I'm talking about with Harold Washington, with Mitterrand. These issues became, and so what I'm pointing out, these things are not recognized by many of the public media popular discussions of diversity. But what we're looking at here is illuminating for disentangling these issues and seeing how does diversity, has it worked in the past in different components that we'll talk about further as we proceed through the sections of the course. Okay. I mentioned last time that race is the deepest cleavage in America. And is it, quote, feudal or is it contemporary? It's both, but it's a connection that goes way back before America began with feudal Europe. Okay. Stone, I'll just say a few words on. Stone basically has a friendly version of Hunter. Same city, Atlanta. Atlanta seems from other bits of evidence to have had more business domination. But Stone suggested that it was activist, but not progressive, quote unquote. That it was supported by a fair number of people of the Black middle class than most other cities in the US. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Martin Luther King was launched in Atlanta. And as well as the city built many expressways, stadiums, underground subway, not to mention hotels and office buildings. And this is what they called their regime. The regime was a friendly version of business leadership. Regime, okay, so that this became very widespread among especially political scientists for about 20, 25 years. But the local regime was seen as dominating. And the term came from this book by Clarence Stone. And he was the father of regime theory, or took all the propositions, although he didn't say it was not a theory. And I will just say, I was at a session with Clarence here in Chicago where we had meetings regularly of the American Political Science Association. What's the future of city politics and so forth? And there were two followers of Clarence Stone who were presenting papers on the panel showing business dominance. And I didn't speak, I spoke after them. And then Clarence spoke. I put my hand on this quote, I'll read it if I don't find it quickly. I will paraphrase. Basically, here we go. Change is afoot. Has the time arrived for the urban regime analysis to receive, quote, burial with honor, unquote? Much urban research, including my own, is centered on the large agenda-setting convergence of power that occupied center stage in the era of redevelopment. This is the politics of Dahl's executive-centered coalition, the growth machine of Logan and Molich, Peterson's developmental politics, others, including my own work on Atlanta's biracial coalition. These don't fit the contemporary world of city politics very well. They are about a period in which two major centers of power, City Hall and a collectively mobilized business sector, came together. Today, this transformation has in the main occurred with its rail and harbor centered form. The industrial city is largely a phenomenon of the past. Basically, governing the post-industrial city is no mere extension of the past. Okay. So almost everybody in the room fell off their chairs, including me. Almost never do you hear someone say, I was wrong for 20 years and most of urban politics was wrong, and following me, things have changed. Okay. So these debates are now going on in political science departments and economics departments, sociology a little bit less. That's it. Okay. How do we deal with these kinds of things? City monies are last reading here, and the basic point is to look at not just one model. Look instead at three or four. I'll touch on the fourth. The first is citizen preferences, strongly stated in Anthony Downs' book that I mentioned last time. Citizens drive the leaders. That's this path. And because they're so strong, the leaders may implement policies that the citizens want. Or the leaders may be in that sense invisible in the way that Adam Smith's invisible hand just gives the market what it wants. So the shopkeeper who sells red shoes doesn't care for red or blue. He has both kinds of shoes that women want. Okay. Instead, if he's really invisible in that way, we can say, hey, we can contrast A, B, and C. C is really the leader. So we can have both dynamic and invisible leaders, two kinds of leadership. Second kind of theory, organized groups. Looking out the window of this university, people here in the 1920s and 30s developed what was called group theory, which was the main theory in political science in those years up to let's say up to roughly the late 60s. Dahl continues parts of this. David Truman was a major theorist for the governmental process. Dahl uses parts of this in Who Governs when he stresses the business groups, the unions of the PTA, the teachers union, and how banks in the third area, that the organized groups differ from issue area to issue area. But organized groups are important, as well as for Dahl, citizens. But Dahl most actively attacked Downs' strong citizen preference theory. The third theory is strong leaders' preferences. Robert Caro's book on the power broker, on the Robert Moses as the not an elected official, but the appointed official of the New York City development, was written about and widely used in public policy courses here and elsewhere. These were dynamic leaders if the leader himself, we talk about Mao or Putin, If the leader is really making that policy rather than the citizens organized groups, then we have a dynamic leader. But these are dichotomies. In fact, we have the relative degree of strength of leaders, and so Biden and others are trying to show I'm powerful. Trump talked about this all the time. So the fourth, just to mention it, which is there's migration. Citizens can move, and if leaders fear that citizens might move, they can change their policy. And so, for instance, not increase taxes too much if they see evidence of this. On the other hand, if they don't see evidence, they may listen more to organized groups. So in the late 60s, you had groups like, you had many Black activist groups who would go into City Hall and stand outside the mayor's office, maybe 50 people if they could get in, and they'd shake the chains. They might have some bullets and strapped across their chest, things of that sort. There was a lot of, and the media would cover this, and then you would have protests in front of city halls all over the US, and they were often three groups, Black activist groups like those, municipal unions who wanted to be able to organize because there were laws often interpreted at the state and local level and federal level that government workers may not be unionized. Okay, that still is a fighting issue. Chicago had no unions except for the bus drivers. City Hall was not unionized under Daley 1. Only under Jane Byrne did she was so outspoken. She, wild lady. she fought the unions. She fought the municipal employees so much that they heavily unionized to fight her better. And we've had stronger unions in Chicago ever since. Okay, so the focus of the book is how can we reconcile these four theories? Not to say that anyone is right or wrong, but they're all partially right and they're all partially wrong. So when and why do we have a Jane Byrne instead of a Harold Washington, or instead of a Daley 1? And how do these work? And how do they bring with them more dynamic? And so basically, I won't try to go through in detail now, but basically we set up a bigger framework like this, including feedback from the policy output, which can be a migration path. Okay, so then we have all of these different arrows that I'm showing here, A, B, C, and then we can have different things in here, which could be E and so forth. This leads into the later sections, especially the political culture sections. So I will leave that there. And Elazar's political culture theory is clearly one kind of answer, but I'm leaving that more for the future. And let me, if we're comfortable, could we show the video?
Yeah. Yes.
If it's easy, we have big differences. I would say if it's easy to show those three, I'm not, I'll see how long it takes to show. I have three for Daley, Jane Byrne, and I think Harold Washington. Or maybe Daley too. I could call them, they're numbered 1, 2, 3. You can easily bring those up, or any one of those. We'll have just a little bit.
This one on the vision.
A little louder.
Yeah, it's muted at the moment, but
Stop. Stop, wait. Okay. Norquist is only the time that I put in the email. You're not at the. Okay.
Right.
So for now, we'll do Norquist and then we can come back and you can see if you can get some of the Chicago leaders. Otherwise, we'll skip it. I don't want to. But ideally, if we set these up in advance, so you've got them at the right place, you can just click and they come right from the internet. That's it. So we don't want the advertisements. We don't have to start from the beginning. So
I have it at the time.
okay. Let's look at Norquist. And you can see the time there now?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at. Okay, that's fine. Is it easy to find, say, the, okay, I'll talk about Norquist briefly, what as you, since you can see something on burn things. Who's Norquist? He was mayor of Milwaukee. He came to 2 terms, I believe. He closed off the exit ramps. So the freeway was still around Milwaukee, but you couldn't get off. They just told him, that you couldn't get off in the city. So basically, they eliminated the freeway as connection to the suburbs and to Chicago or other places. They heightened pedestrian access. And they put, very careful. Did I disconnect them? Okay, good. And that's what he talked. So he talked about the same thing happened in Seoul on a much larger scale. After being mayor, he wanted to take this internationally. He became the executive director of the the Council for Urban, I'm forgetting the last word, but it's a movement of planners, developers, not really developers, anti-developers, planners and how to develop without developers, and feature the The, the, the consumption and lifestyle of citizens and housing and pedestrians most visible, which you talked about in the cities. I mention it because he came here, he gave a talk in this class, and he presented medieval Italian cities as if the first half of the talk, you could have been an art historian. It was amazing. He said nothing about the mayors or whatever, just said, this is the aesthetics of how cities should be built for pedestrians. You have a view of the palace, a view of the church, and the pedestrians can see this and see that. He went, and then he went through how he did this in Milwaukee. And his book, we'll read his book later on in the course. Milwaukee is important. It's a critical city nationally, and it's generated some very creative kinds of policies. But before him, they basically involved using big money from the national government. He said the opposite. This is killing us. We don't want those big handouts from Washington. We want the opposite. We're going to do what we want because the people in Washington don't understand us. And so, but the same thing happened. I'm just pointing this out because this happened in France, less in France than elsewhere, although Mitterrand, I'm showing I just mentioned the reaction at the local level and how this is still fought over, and it's being fought over in Germany. But basically, most of the national governments decentralized their big social welfare policies. And they gave them that they cut back, but they generally, I mean, you have two different, I won't go into details, but the traditional left says you must spend more if you are on the left. The traditional right says the opposite, cut government. The new political culture says continue the good social programs, but don't cut but do cut taxes. How can you possibly cut taxes and continue the programs? I'll ask you a question. How can you logically resolve that apparent ideological contradiction? Hand up, yeah.
Maybe borrowing money.
Just a little louder.
Borrowing money.
Yes, and this is being discussed in Washington this week. Then you can, but that's a weaker, less visible form of spending, but it's dead. Yeah.
You increase the taxpayer base?
You what?
Increase the taxpayer base?
Potentially, yes, but that's still spending, and that's still that you increase it in order to spend, but maybe not so much. But that's a good example. It's a quasi, yeah.
You allow them to be baptized? You allow them to be baptized?
No, I can't quite hear the words.
You let business take over?
Okay, let me give you the quick answer. Increase productivity. If you can make government this thing up, so how to do this is not easy to easily implement, but at least ideologically, what it does is focus on the potential of productivity. If we can have staff work more efficiently, they can build more swimming pools, more roads, fix more potholes. And so Bill Clinton and his vice president started the internet. Internet? That have a big impact? Huge, global. Okay. That was, I mean, that's one of the most visible examples, but this was at the core of their ideological focus to maintain good services. They did not want to do what Reagan and Thatcher done, just cut the programs. They said, we want to maintain every good program we can, where our hearts are on the left, but we're trying to hold down the taxes. And so they found things like the internet, and there are all kinds of case studies of international. Yes, ma'am.
So I heard you said that they're decentralizing.
A little slower and clearer and louder.
I heard you say that they're decentralizing their social welfare program. Could you?
Just slower, please.
Okay, welfare programs. Could you describe more about what that means?
The most dramatic example was New York City, which from the late 19th century onward directly supported its public welfare, public hospitals, and public housing. Most cities in the US had none of these. They said, we will not permit the city government, we won't do it in our own budget. And they also said, we will not permit our staff to apply for any federal government program involving public health, public welfare, and public housing. Texas, California, most visibly and obvious in the local governments where they said, you may not do this. Chicago was in, so LA included, there's a whole, I don't want to go into more detail than necessary. Chicago's in the middle. Chicago basically said to its staff, apply for all the money you can get in Washington. And so we have public health, public wealth, all of these three programs. Cook County Hospitals free. A lot of public housing, the public housing is mainly New York, Atlanta, and Chicago. Most cities don't have any public housing. It's any serious or St. Louis a little bit. Chicago, however, said with a strong Daley tradition, as soon as that money ends in Washington, we're going to close down these programs. And they did. This was a big difference between New York and Chicago in the 1975 New York fiscal crisis. So when Chicago did that, what did New York do? We could never close a hospital. We will borrow, we, the city government, will give more money to the hospitals, to the public housing, to those programs the federal government maybe not supporting. And we'll borrow through the debt market. And the state of New York will back us up and we'll borrow and borrow. And so they borrowed more and more. And then finally the bankers and the others said, hey, no more. And then what happened? City couldn't, just like Washington right now. City couldn't meet a budget, basically bankrupt. So the federal government then appointed a fiscal board of overseers and said, okay, we'll give you the little bits of money one bit at a time. And they gave them, I think, $2.4 billion. But it was supervised and any amount over certain, okay, so basically the federal government came in, but people then said, why is New York doing this? Anybody want to guess based on what we've heard about? And I haven't told too much, but if you read about or thought about this, go ahead and speak up. Quick answer is Chicago had a tough, centralized political machine. And Daley won, would say, if people came into his office and we want to have a new park, he would say, well, how many people live there and so forth? And say, no, you don't have enough. Sorry. In New York, the opposite. People would walk in the mayor's office with chains or with, just the park supporters or people who wanted this or that. And the mayor of New York regularly would say, yes, 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 because the mayor was weak compared to Chicago. It's a classic example of dynamic, strong mayors versus a weaker mayor. And so that as the mayor of New York couldn't really say, no, I shouldn't say that. The mayors with that policy perspective of saying citizens, I want to respond to citizens. So you can look at the city money discussion of the riots which took place and compare that to the riots basically that took place in Chicago and Baltimore, Atlanta, other cities across the U.S. in the last 2 years following the Minneapolis police. So the police now with diversity and the battles over this with Black Lives Matter is very, very close to what happened in '68. We will draw out some of those comparisons, but the last 2 years, you don't know, most of you, the kind of things I'm talking about, but we have research and evidence and comparisons which illuminate. Okay. Find anything?
You wanted to show the burn?
Sure, please.
Of course.
Give it a try. The most colorful, the most amazing. Okay, that's good. And you get a little bit of flavor. Anything else quickly available or not?
Yes, there's a video about Richard Daley, Chicago riots.
Okay. Okay, that was 1968 National Democratic Party Convention. He was the local chair. People came to 68 disturbances, we want to be part of this convention. We want to come into and demonstration. What did Daley do? He called the police, they dragged people away, blocked the visible TV coverage. And people then started doing surveys, first of Chicago citizens, then of national citizens, saying, do you support Mayor Daley? Did he use too much, too little, or the right amount of force? And what did the citizen survey show? Anybody want to guess? Too much. Okay. Certainly, that was the expectation. Everybody said he's completely, he's a local fascist, et cetera, et cetera. Majority of US citizens, majority of Chicago citizens said he used too little or about the right amount of force. And the media people didn't believe it. I mean, the media people said, look at what we showed. We showed the story. I mean, look at this confrontation. But there has been a change, I would say. That is over time, the American public has grown more and more tolerant. And the Chinese national leaders in Tiananmen Square did the same thing as they did. The Chinese national leaders with Hong Kong were more like closer to, let's say, Lori Lightfoot. Just let the rioters go on for weeks and weeks and months and months.
Yeah, 2 more videos that you sent us.
Yes, let's see. How's our time?
5:48, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Well, now let's have commentary and discussion from you folks. Any more general questions or anything? Yes.
Are there any good books about John Norquist on Milwaukee or about
Yeah, on the reading list. He's on the reading list. He's done a biography of Milwaukee and his policies.
Yeah, not just in, but also like some of these other examples of like removal, like in Seoul, like in Brisbane.
So like,
Tree removal in Seoul and Brisbane, Australia.
yes, these are written up in a number of places. I mean, especially Seoul. I mean, Seoul is highly controversial. But there's a lot of writing. No, I'd say just start with the internet search and you'll find stuff pretty easily. Other comments or questions? And in the case of Korea, I mean, this is how does Korea and the beautification by tearing down the freeways in Norquist, how does that fit with the video we had last time? Lollapalooza, you know.
This kind of idea of like city has like a place to visit, place to like enjoy yourself versus just like primarily transit, primarily getting employed and making it a destination. River is a destination just like
We're showing you the pieces and how the pieces fit together. I mean, your first reaction is Lollapalooza drives economic development. I mean, I've had people say, are you maintaining that Lollapalooza was really the driver of Chicago's economic growth? And most of the economic development writing would say, would not even mention anything like that, or would say that's ridiculous. Of course not. We're looking for bits of evidence, and I'm pointing to Norquist as a critical example of a local, national, and international player. And the specifics of freeways and pedestrians is not just Milwaukee, it's international. In Seoul, it was so successful that he was elected president of Korea, based on tearing down the freeway and making the river a beautiful place. Okay. Let's end there. When you're mayor, remember that. And we'll talk about more as we proceed, and keep looking for questions as we continue discussion.